The moment I stepped into Director Harmon's office and saw the old man from the diner sitting in the chair across from her desk, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a quiet expression like he had all the time in the world, my brain completely stopped working. He recognized me before I recognized what was happening. The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to it. Patient. Like he had been expecting this exact moment. Director Harmon looked up from her desk. "Rachel," she said, "close the door." I closed the door. I stood there with my hand still on the handle because I wasn't sure my legs were going to cooperate if I let go of something solid. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this actually started about 3 weeks before that morning, on a Tuesday in October when I was just trying to eat lunch before my afternoon caseload swallowed me whole. I had been working at Cornerstone Community Health Clinic for 4 years. We were a nonprofit in Dayton, Ohio, one of those places that runs on grant money and goodwill, and the kind of tired determination that shows up in people who chose this work knowing it would never make them rich. We served low-income families, unhoused individuals, people who had fallen through every crack the system had to offer. I was a licensed social worker, which meant my days were a long sequence of phone calls that didn't get returned, insurance forms that got rejected, and trying to help people navigate a system that seemed specifically designed to exhaust them into giving up. I loved it anyway. I want to be clear about that. I loved the work the way you love something that costs you something real. The diner was called May's. It was half a block from the clinic. The kind of place with laminate menus and coffee that came in a ceramic mug and a lunch counter where the same people sat on the same stools every day. I ate there probably 3 times a week because it was fast and cheap, and the woman who owned it, May herself, always remembered that I didn't want onions. That Tuesday I came in around 12:15, later than usual because a morning meeting had run long. The lunch rush was already thinning out. I grabbed a stool at the counter and ordered the turkey melt and a water, and I was scrolling through my phone looking at a housing placement I needed to follow up on when I noticed the man 2 stools down. He was older, somewhere in his mid-70s I would have guessed. White hair, neatly combed, a plain blue windbreaker, the kind with a zip up front. He had a cup of coffee and a bowl of soup in front of him, and he was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who is comfortable being alone. Not lonely, just settled. He reminded me a little of my grandfather. Something about the way he held his coffee cup with both hands. I hadn't been paying attention to him specifically until I heard May's voice change. May had one of those voices that was warm about 95% of the time, and when the temperature dropped even a little, you noticed it. "I'm sorry, hun," she was saying. "It's coming back declined." The man looked down at his card. Then he looked back up at May with an expression that was very careful and very still. "Let me try it again," he said. "I ran it twice." "I see." He was quiet for a moment. "I apologize. I think there may be a problem with the account. I'm not sure I have cash on me." He checked his wallet. He had, I could see from where I was sitting, about $4. The soup and coffee together were probably $7 or $8. Not a lot of money in the abstract. A lot of money when it's the difference between eating and not eating, even for a few hours. And something about the way he was handling it very quietly, very without drama, the way people handle embarrassment when they've lived long enough to know that making a scene doesn't help anything, something about that got to me. I didn't think about it very long. I caught May's eye and I tilted my head very slightly toward the man and I held up 2 fingers, which was our shorthand for "add it to mine." May had a good poker face when she needed one. She just nodded once and moved away to the register. The man put his wallet back in his pocket. He looked at the soup like he was going to say something to May about leaving it, and then May came back and said "all taken care of" in a tone that didn't invite follow-up questions, and he looked a little confused but he didn't push it. I had already turned back to my phone. I didn't want him to know it was me. That's not me being falsely modest, I just know from years of doing this work that being the recipient of someone's visible kindness can sometimes feel worse than the original problem. People have dignity. They don't always want to be seen in the moment of needing something. I finished my lunch, left May a cash tip on the counter, and walked back to the clinic. I didn't think much more about it. It was $7. It was a Tuesday. What I was thinking about, honestly, was Director Harmon. Sandra Harmon had come to Cornerstone 8 months before as the new executive director. She had a background in hospital administration and a master's in public health and a management style that I could only describe as precision erosion. She didn't come at you directly. She didn't yell or make speeches. She just quietly, consistently, and thoroughly made you feel like everything you were doing was slightly wrong. With me, it had started small. A comment in a staff meeting about my documentation being behind, which it was, by 2 days, because I had spent those 2 days getting an emergency family placement that fell through at 11 p.m. A question about whether my case numbers were sustainable, delivered in front of the whole team with that particular tone that makes a question sound like a verdict. Then there was the incident with the Henderson family. The Hendersons were one of my long-term cases. A mother, 2 kids, complicated situation involving a landlord who knew how to stay exactly on the legal side of harassment. I had been working with them for 18 months. We were close to a real resolution, a housing voucher coming through, the older daughter finally stable in school. Director Harmon had decided, without consulting me, to reassign the case to a newer staff member. When I asked why, she said she was redistributing caseload for efficiency. When I pushed back respectfully, I thought she said she was concerned that my personal investment in certain cases was affecting my professional objectivity. I had been doing this work for 4 years. I had never had a complaint. My supervisor before Harmon had given me nothing but strong reviews, and now I was being told that caring about my clients was a liability. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. It got worse from there. Every week there was something new, a procedure I hadn't followed correctly, a form submitted to the wrong department, a meeting I was supposed to attend that I had apparently not been told about. Some of it was legitimate. Most of it felt like paperwork being generated for a purpose I couldn't quite name yet, but could feel coming the way you feel weather before it arrives. My colleague Denise, who had been at Cornerstone for 9 years and had survived 3 different directors, pulled me aside one afternoon in the copy room and said, very quietly, "She's building a file on you. Rachel, I've seen it before." "Why?" I said. Denise just looked at me. "You push back," she said. "That's enough." I didn't sleep well for the next week. The thing that happened 2 weeks after the diner started on a Monday morning with an email. Director Harmon had scheduled an all-staff meeting for Wednesday at 9, and the subject line said, "Organizational Restructuring Update." In my experience, when executives call a meeting with that subject line, someone is leaving, and it is usually not voluntary. I spent Monday and Tuesday in a state of low-grade dread. I kept doing my work because what else do? You keep showing up. You make the calls, you fill out the forms, you sit across from people in the worst moments of their lives and you try to be useful. But underneath all of it was this quiet drumbeat of anxiety that I couldn't quite turn off. Tuesday afternoon, I ran into a situation with a client that required me to stay late. By the time I finished and wrote up my notes, it was past 7 and the building was mostly empty. I was walking to the parking lot when I passed Director Harmon's office and saw that her light was still on and she was on the phone. And through the glass, I could see she was writing something on a legal pad, and even though I couldn't read it from where I was standing, I had the unsettling feeling that whatever it was had something to do with me. I drove home. I ate cereal for dinner because I didn't have the energy to cook. I called my mother, who lives outside of Columbus, and I didn't tell her what was going on because she worries, and I didn't have the bandwidth to manage both my anxiety and hers at the same time. I just talked to her about ordinary things, her garden, my nephew's soccer game, whether the weather was going to turn before Thanksgiving. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment and I thought, not for the first time, about what I would do if I lost this job, whether I could find another position quickly, whether I had enough in savings to cover the gap, whether Cornerstone was the only place I could do work that mattered to me. I thought about the Hendersons. I thought about the 17 other families on my caseload and what it would mean for them if I was gone. I thought about the old man at Mays, and I thought with the slightly irrational logic that sometimes visits you late at night, I hope his card situation got sorted out. I hope he got home okay. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold. I got to the clinic early and poured myself coffee and sat at my desk and read through my emails with the methodical attention of someone who is managing their own nerves through routine. The all-staff meeting was in the main conference room. There were 12 of us on the clinical and social work staff. We filed in and took our usual seats, and Director Harmon stood at the front of the room with a printed agenda that she distributed, and that sense she always had of being the only person in the room with a complete picture of what was about to happen. She talked for about 10 minutes about the clinic's budget situation. Grant funding was down. Operating costs were up. She had been in conversation with the board about the path forward, and she wanted to be transparent with the team about what that meant structurally. Then she talked about realigning program priorities. And then she looked at a specific section of the agenda and she said, "My name." She said that the role of senior social worker was being reclassified as part of the restructuring. She said that she had some specific concerns about performance in that role that she wanted to address in a separate conversation. She said it all in the same, even, administrative tone she used for everything, and the room got very quiet in the specific way. Rooms get quiet when everyone knows what they are witnessing, and no one knows what to do about it. I kept my face still. I had learned to do that. After the meeting broke up, Denise caught my eye across the room. She looked at me with the careful expression of someone who wants to say, "I told you so," but cares about you too much to say it out loud. Director Harmon told me she wanted to meet with me at 2 o'clock. I spent the rest of the morning doing my job. I made 3 calls. I drove out to check on a placement. I ate lunch at my desk. I hadn't gone to Mays in a week and a half. Just hadn't had the heart for it somehow. At 1:45, I went to the bathroom and looked at my face in the mirror for a moment and told myself that whatever happened in the next hour, I had done good work here. That was real. Nobody could restructure that away. At 1:58, I walked to Director Harmon's office. And that is where I came in at the beginning. Except I left out the part where I knocked and she said, "Come in," and I pushed open the door and there he was. The man from Mays. He was sitting in the chair to the left of Harmon's desk, the one usually reserved for her assistant or for whomever she was meeting with, which meant that whoever he was not here to be managed. He was sitting as a peer, maybe higher than a peer. He had the same stillness I had noticed at the counter, the same quality of complete ease, and he was wearing the charcoal suit now instead of the blue windbreaker, and there were no 4 stars on his shoulders because this wasn't the military, but the way he occupied the room said something about authority that had nothing to do with a uniform. I closed the door. I stood there. Director Harmon said, "Rachel, I'd like you to meet someone. This is Mr. Gerald Aldis." The name hit me about 2 seconds after she said it. Gerald Aldis. Aldis Family Foundation. The name was on our grant documentation, on the wall of the clinic's lobby, on the letterhead of the letter that had come every year for the past 11 years funding a significant portion of our operating budget. Gerald Aldis had founded the foundation after his wife died. She had been a social worker, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades quietly sustaining organizations like ours across the state of Ohio. He was, by any measure, one of the most significant reasons Cornerstone existed at all. He was also looking at me with that same, almost smile. "We've met," he said. Director Harmon looked at him. Then she looked at me. "You know each other?" "Briefly," he said. "About 3 weeks ago." He turned to me. "May's Diner. Tuesday lunch." I didn't say anything for a moment. "The soup," I finally said. "The soup," he agreed. Director Harmon was looking between the two of us with an expression I had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a person who has very carefully constructed a situation and is now watching it reconstruct itself along completely different lines. Mr. Aldis leaned back slightly in his chair. He said, "Miss Harmon, I'll be direct with you, because I think you're someone who appreciates directness." He said this in a tone that suggested he thought she might appreciate it in theory more than in practice. I try to visit the organizations our foundation supports once a year. Sometimes more. I don't call ahead. I don't announce myself. I find it more useful to see things as they actually are. He paused for a moment. The room was very quiet. I was in the neighborhood of Mays because I had been sitting in your parking lot for about an hour that Tuesday morning. I watched the staff arrive. I watched how they interacted with clients in the entryway. I listened to a phone call through the front window, someone trying to get information, and whoever answered was patient and helpful in a way that was notable. He tilted his head slightly. And then I went to Mays for lunch, because I was hungry, and I had a card problem that turned out to be a technical issue my bank resolved that afternoon. "A small thing," I said. I wasn't sure why I said it. "The small things are often the real thing," he said. In my experience, Director Harmon cleared her throat. "Mr. Aldis," she said, and the way she said it was a recalibration, the sound of someone shifting weight. "I'm glad you're here today. There are some structural changes I've been discussing with the board." "I've spoken with the board," he said mildly. "That's actually why I'm here." He let that sit in the room for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Harmon, I've reviewed the performance documentation you submitted regarding the senior social worker position. I've also spoken with several members of your clinical staff. He looked at me when he said this, not in a way that implicated anyone, just in a way that acknowledged the truth of what he was saying. What I'm hearing about is an extremely effective practitioner who has been placed under escalating administrative pressure for the better part of 8 months. I have concerns about Director Harmon started. You have documentation, Mr. Aldis said. That's different from concerns. Documentation can be generated for many purposes. He was still calm. He was the calmest person I had ever been in a room with. I've seen this before, in other organizations. A new director arrives. They feel the need to establish authority. They identify the staff members who have standing relationships and institutional knowledge, and they begin to reframe that as a management problem. Director Harmon was quiet. The Aldis Family Foundation has been a funding partner of Cornerstone for 11 years, he said. We've supported this clinic because of its outcomes, its staff, its connection to the community it serves. He looked at the agenda still sitting on Harmon's desk. I would like to understand the business case for eliminating a senior position that is directly responsible for a significant portion of those outcomes. The business case, it turned out, was not strong. I won't walk through all of it, because some of it belongs to people who aren't me, and some of it is still being sorted through processes that take time. What I can tell you is that the meeting lasted another 40 minutes, and that Director Harmon said less and less as it went on, and that by the end of it the proposed restructuring had been tabled pending a full board review, and the reclassification of my position had been described, gently but clearly, as premature. When Mr. Aldis stood up to leave, Director Harmon shook his hand and said she appreciated his perspective. He thanked her for her time. He looked at me and said, "Miss Caro, do you have 5 minutes?" We walked out into the hallway together. The afternoon light was coming through the windows at the end of the corridor, and it was that particular October light that makes everything look a little more considered than it usually does. He said, "You didn't want me to know it was you. At May's." "No," I said. "Why not?" I thought about how to answer that. "Because it wasn't about me," I said. "It was just, I don't know. It was just the thing to do." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to say that," he said. "She used to say that good work is just what you do when you stop asking yourself whether you're going to get credit for it." He looked down the hallway, toward the waiting area, where a woman was sitting with a young boy who was coloring in a book. She worked in a clinic not unlike this one. For about 30 years. "I didn't know that," I said. "Most people don't." He buttoned the top button of his jacket. "I want to say something to you, Miss Caro, and I hope you'll hear it the way it's intended." I waited. "What I observed here today, and I want to be clear, the diner has nothing to do with it. I was already here before the diner. I had already been watching. What I observed here suggests that you are someone with exactly the qualities this kind of work requires. The patience, the persistence, the willingness to advocate even when the room is not with you." He looked at me directly. Those qualities are not always comfortable for people who lead with authority rather than service. I thought about Director Harmon. I thought about the last 8 months. I thought about the Henderson family and the case I'd been pulled from. "Will the board review?" I started. "I can't tell you how that process will unfold," he said. "I can tell you that I have been doing this for 22 years, and I know what I saw in your documentation, and I know what I heard from your colleagues." He picked up his briefcase from where he'd set it against the wall. "Keep doing your work, Miss Caro. The way you've been doing it." He walked to the end of the hallway and through the front door. I watched him go. For a long moment I just stood there in the corridor. The boy in the waiting area finished his drawing and held it up to show his mother. She leaned over and said something to him, and he looked very pleased. I went back to my desk. I had 2 calls to return and a referral form to submit before 5 o'clock. I sat down and I picked up the phone and I started with the first number. 2 weeks after that meeting, I got an email from the Cornerstone board chair. She wanted to schedule time to speak with me directly. She said the board had completed its preliminary review and had some questions about clinical operations and program outcomes. She said they valued my institutional knowledge and perspective. I scheduled the meeting. I also heard from Denise, who heard from someone on the admin team who had overheard a conversation that Director Harmon had been asked to take a leave of absence while the review continued. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I've been in this work long enough to know that when someone loses a position, there are usually many more layers to the story than the version you see from the outside. I hope she lands somewhere that's a better fit. I genuinely mean that. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name, something like the way the air feels after a long tension finally releases. Not joy, exactly. Relief, maybe. And underneath the relief, the same thing that had kept me coming to work every morning for 4 years through the bad paperwork and the funding gaps and all of it, the belief that the work mattered, that it was worth protecting. The Henderson case was reassigned back to me 2 weeks later. The housing voucher came through in November. The older daughter made honor roll in December. I went to May's the first Friday in November. It was cold and the lunch rush had already peaked when I came in, so I got a seat at the counter without waiting. May set a ceramic mug of coffee in front of me before I ordered. "Haven't seen you in a while," she said. "Busy spell," I told her. She filled the mug and slid the creamer over. "The old guy came back in," she said, matter of fact, refilling someone else's cup while she talked. "The one from about a month ago. Paid his whole tab in cash. Left me a 50. I looked up from my coffee. Left something else too." She pulled a small folded card from under the register and handed it to me. On the front, it said Aldis Family Foundation. On the back, in careful handwriting, "For May, thank you for the welcome. For Rachel, keep going." I set the card on the counter. May was already moving down to take someone else's order. The coffee was hot and the diner smelled like toast, and the street outside was ordinary and cold and full of people going wherever they were going. I thought about something Mr. Aldis had said in the hallway, that his wife had worked in a clinic not unlike this one for 30 years. 30 years. I had been doing this for 4, and some days it already felt like it took everything I had. But then I thought about the Henderson boy showing me his art project last week, 7 years old, incredibly solemn about it, explaining to me why the sky in the painting was green instead of blue. I had asked him why, and he thought about it for a second and said, because green was his favorite and it was his painting, so he got to decide. That's why, I thought. That's the whole reason. I drank my coffee. I left May her usual tip. I walked back to the clinic in the cold November air with my hands in my pockets, and somewhere around the middle of the block, I noticed that I wasn't bracing myself the way I had been for 8 months. My shoulders weren't up around my ears. The dread that had been sitting underneath everything for so long had gone quiet. The clinic was warm when I pushed open the door. Our receptionist, Kevin, looked up from his desk and said, "You've got a 2 o'clock," and handed me a stack of message slips, and I took them and went to my office and sat down and turned on my computer. A 2 o'clock. A stack of messages. 17 families on my caseload and a funding review in 3 weeks, and forms that needed to be filed and phone calls that needed to be made, and people who needed exactly what I knew how to give them. I hung up my coat. I picked up the phone. I got to work.